When Germany was occupied, the first thing the American, British, French, and Canadian liberators did was they went into the Ministry of Education and they took out all the Nazi propaganda and they destroyed the propaganda, much of it racist, much of it silenced the violence the Nazis committed themselves, and they started building a realistic version, a realistic history of German history. And after that, since 1945, entire generations of Germans were educated with a correct and truthful, accurate narrative of their own history. This is the crucial difference, I think. And in a way, you can't even blame these people. If they have never been taught anything better, if this is all they know, this is the stultification of Turkish society, of keeping it dumb, keeping it ignorant. But there are some glimmers of hope. I'll talk about that in a second. Now, most of these destruction of memory and construction of memory was geared towards the internal audience, towards the Turkish population. There's also a global process going on, global efforts of denial, the denial industry. And there's a whole range of denial policies. Many books have been written on it. I don't want to get into it too much, but I'd like to point out two things. The denial that is geared towards the internal audience, so the national efforts, they're somewhat different than those geared towards the international audience. So internally, they do something slightly different from the outward, the external policy. Now, nationally, there's an Institute of Armenian Studies in Ankara. All it does is produce denial and forms of denial, very intricate and sophisticated forms of mystification and manipulation. The Turkish Penal Code, although very short, had an article in which insulting Turkishness was a crime, punishable with prosecution. The Ministry of Education issued a directive in 2003 in which the teachers, and we have a teacher, of course, with us, all teachers were instructed to give a positive view of Turkish history. Now, of course, the nonsensical here is, of course, that no country in the world has only positive history. It doesn't exist. That includes, without any exception, I think all states have darker pages in their history. It's normal. Of course, the murder of Hrant Dink was probably the pinnacle, or it was the zenith of this denial industry. Because Hrant was somebody who went on actual television and he said, I am Armenian and I think there was a genocide. End of story. When he said these things on national television, the society, Turkish society, almost stopped functioning. And I remember there was a debate that started at 8 in the evening and went on until 3 in the night because people kept calling in and asking for clarification from Hrant. Now there's also, and this is very important, there are international and transnational efforts of denial. The Turkish government is running a worldwide, uniform denial policy. What does this mean? It means that everywhere I go, everywhere where I've given lectures, I'm in Toronto now, I've been in Buenos Aires, I've been in all over Europe, all over North America, everywhere I go, it's always the same guy in the same suit with the same briefcase, sitting in the back of the room. He kind of looks like this gentleman out there. Sitting in the back of the room, always coming up with the exact same arguments against the genocide thesis. There was no intentional killing. The Armenians rebelled, worked with the Russian state. And thirdly, it was all a long time ago. So never more and never less. It's always the exact same bullet points. Now what does that prove to you? That somebody, the same official from the foreign ministry, from Los Angeles to Buenos Aires to Moscow to Amsterdam and to Toronto, this means that this is policy. A few men sat together in the foreign ministry in Ankara and they decided that this was going to be the policy. And they decided to send it out as a policy note to the whole world, and all of the ambassadors have to carry this out. This also means that this gentleman over here, he's not denying the genocide out of his own initiative. He doesn't show up at events like this and stand up and deny the genocide because he wants to, necessarily, but because it's his job. It also means that if he doesn't, if he thinks, well, I read a good book and I don't believe in this, then he will be fired. So the culture of denial at the foreign ministry perpetuates itself in many ways. Once, I'll give this an interesting personal anecdote. I met the former Turkish ambassador to Ireland when I was living in Dublin. I was working in Dublin. Very kind man, always impeccably dressed. He had a degree from Harvard. And once he joined the conference, because he has to come to the conference to deny the genocide. And then after the conference, we had a dinner. And then we sat down, he sat next to me. Of course, I got a little bit nervous. Why is the ambassador coming next to me? Probably to badger me. No, he leaned over and probably had a couple of glasses of wine too much. And he said, Ugur, you know, I know it was a genocide, but don't quote me on it. So this is his internal struggle that he has to cope with. He's way too smart to really believe in all the nonsense that the uneducated pedestrians at the foreign ministry are coming up with. Unsophisticated theories about completely unconvincing. But he has to because it's his job. So that's in politics and diplomacy. Also, my second point here, my last point, is there are also efforts to manipulate academic research. And this is where I feel personally offended as a university professor. The Turkish government is channeling an enormous amount of money into academic life. I personally witnessed this in Utrecht, at the university in the Netherlands, where I also teach. We have, I can say this openly, it is not a secret, that the University of Utah has given a chair, a professorship, to a certain gentleman by the name of Hakan Yavuz. I think because this is a state university, it's public intellectual, this has to be discussed publicly. The enormous amounts of money that this gentleman is receiving to write about a subject in which he's not even specialized is only one example. The government is interested in infiltrating genocide studies, but also First World War studies. This year, 2014, it's exactly 100 years ago. So what we've seen is many conferences and books are coming out on the First World War. In many of these conferences and books, there are discussions about the genocide. Most respectable historians, they discuss it openly. And the Turkish government tries to get its foot in the door here. Like, I have to say, other governments also try to manipulate the record of history. The Turkish government is not alone here. Now, is there any good news? Yes, there is. I'd like to say a few things on social memory at the end, because we hear often Turkey denies the Armenian Genocide. This has become a jingle, and that's true. I just explained that the Turkish state's official policy is denial on all levels. But if you gauge in Turkish society what place the genocide takes, even after almost 100 years, we see the complete opposite picture. The research, my research and that of others, clearly suggests that there's a very sharp clash between what the state says and what the society says. And I'd like to point that out with a few examples. In the summers of 2002, 2004, right after the Zorian course, 2005, 6, and 7, I conducted many interviews with senior citizens, grandchildren of eyewitnesses of the genocide, and most of these in eastern Turkey. These people were about in their 80s, some in their 90s, so they didn't see the genocide themselves, but they were either small children or they heard about it from their parents. I interviewed these people, I structured the interviews, I taped them. Some people were unwilling to speak. As soon as the word Ermeni came out of my mouth, they would go into a different room or they would kick me out of the house. That's a minority, a small minority. Others agreed to speak. They said, okay, I can talk to you, but I want to be anonymous. Don't say my name. Fine, we can deal with that. And again, others who were very happy and openly talked about what they heard and some what they saw. These interviews were very fruitful. Elderly Turks and Kurds, they remember vivid anecdotes from those who have witnessed or participated in the genocide. I'll give you a few examples. And this brings me to the promise I made to you in the beginning of my lecture. How did I get involved in studying the Armenian Genocide? So the lady on the right is my grandmother from my mother's side. She passed away a couple of years ago. In 2002, I was sitting in her living room in Istanbul, and she was cooking. I was explaining to the lady, when you have to cook green beans, the fasulye, you have to break them. So she was breaking these, sitting in her room, and the television was on. And the television there was a denial program. There were two Turkish professors, they were talking that the genocide never happened, etc. And I'm sitting there, and I looked at this program, listening to the arguments, and then I turned to my grandmother and I said, "Grandma, what do you know about this, this Armenian history?" And she broke a bean and she looked up to me and she said, "Don't you know that? The Armenians were all killed in the first year of the war." And I said, "Grandma, what are you saying?" And she said, "Well, when I was a little girl, my mother, who was in her 30s then, she went up to the hill. We have a village in Erzincan. She went on the hill and she saw the mass killing of the Armenians who were all killed on the bridge outside the city. And this corresponds exactly with what we know about the killings of the Armenians of Erzincan." And I asked her, "But what do you mean? I mean, who killed them?" And she said, "Well, the state, devlet." I said, "Okay, who is the state?" And she said, "Gendarmes. They were dressed in black. They came, they had bayonets, and they bayoneted people and then kicked them in the river." And I said to myself, I thought, how is it possible that the Turkish government on television, internationally, and also within the country, is denying a genocide that my own grandmother remembers? So I thought, am I unique in this? After all these interviews with these people, I can safely say to you, I'm not unique. There are hundreds of thousands of people in Turkey whose parents and grandparents have very realistic, very vivid memories of the genocide. It's just that nobody ever asked them about it. The lady on the right, fascinating story. She was from Diyarbakir, and she told me that these are Kurdish people, and she told me that her father told her, this was a story in the village, that when the government came and raided their village was mixed, Kurdish Armenian, in Lice. This is in North Diyarbakir region. The gendarmes came in and they asked for all the Armenian men. The Kurds were paralyzed, they didn't know what to do. They allowed the government to take away their Armenian villagers, except for one man. He happened to be in the fields, so he was picking fruit. So he got away. He came back to the village. The village was completely empty. There was nobody there. So he started crying. "What's going on? Where's my family?" And the Kurds said, "Don't say a thing. If you leave the village, if you go to the city, you will be arrested, and they will send you also to the deportation, to the kafile, as they said in Kurdish." And he agreed. He stayed in the village, and he was sheltered by this lady's father. He was sheltered for a few months, and then the Turkish government began hunting Armenians in villages, because they found out that some of them got away. They were hiding, they were being sheltered illegally. And then at some point, it became really difficult for her father to shelter this Armenian man. He had to live in the stable with the animals. He could only come out at night. He had to hide all the time. This was really difficult for months to live like this. So ultimately, the Turkish police, the gendarmerie, came to the village and they said, "If we ever find a single Armenian person in this village, we will send all of you also to the deportation, all of the Kurds." This put so much pressure on the Kurdish community that the other villagers told her father, "We know you're keeping that Armenian man over there. Please give him to the government, otherwise it's us." So ultimately what happened is that her father, one night, took that man out and killed him himself. So stories like this are extremely intimate, It's not easy for her to confess that her father was a murderer. It was very difficult for her. There are many other examples. These stories, I have to say, if there's only one message I'd like to give today, I think these stories have to be written down. And this can be done with a large oral history project. Some of my colleagues in Istanbul have already begun doing this research. They're asking, sometimes after months of preparation work, you need to get to know people, they need to trust you. Only after a period they're willing to tell these stories. But I think this would be a fascinating collective discussion about how the Armenian genocide is denied by the Turkish state, but not necessarily by the Turkish society. There are a few explanations of this denial that I mentioned. I'll quickly run through them, and then I'll get to the good news again. Political. The Turkish government has nothing to gain politically from acknowledging the genocide. On the contrary, they might lose power by doing so. Secondly, there are economic reasons for denial. There's a massive fear of reparation and restitution. The lady who did the interview with me asked, are there any archives closed or open in Turkey? There are two important archives are closed. The military archives, which is normal, many countries have restrictions on military archives. But secondly also, the property archives are closed. So if you're interested in finding out whether your father or your mother or your grandparents had any property left, you won't find out. We tried many times to apply to this archive, and every time they sent us back, they said, we don't have an archive, which we know is not true. Third, there are some sociological explanations of denial. If you are an ordinary Turkish person, let's say a university professor, and you're working at a state university, the risks of being ostracized, of being shunned in society, of being expelled, excommunicated from the society, are very high if you speak about the Armenian genocide. People are silent, not necessarily because they believe the denial, but they don't want to be ostracized. The fourth important thing is memory. There's a fear of identity loss. If this aspect of Turkish history is wrong, is a lie, what else is a lie? What can we still build upon in terms of the continuity of the Turkish memory? There's some gender issues as well. I think a lot of women, especially in diplomat women, I found out that many of them were denying the genocide actively, much more actively than men. I think this is because they want to get ahead in the patriarchy. It's difficult for a Turkish woman to make a career in foreign ministry. By being more anti-Armenian, they score points, I think, with their superiors. And of course, there are also psychological problems. If you have been lied to for 99 years, how would it be possible that one day the Turkish president would appear on television and say, by the way, we've been lying to you for 99 years. It's the exact opposite of what we've been telling you. That is very, very difficult to digest, I think. There are some glimmers of hope. There is some good news as well. And these encouraging developments that the ambassador mentioned, I noticed especially in Diyarbakir. Diyarbakir is in the southeast of Turkey. It was heavily Armenian, Assyrian, Kurdish minority, very small minority of Turks. What we see in Diyarbakir since 2003 is a certain decentralization of the state. So not the governor, but the mayor has been able, through this reorganization of the state, the mayor has been devolved quite a lot of power. The mayor was a Kurdish man called Osman Baydemir, and he changed quite a few things. To give an example, all Armenian intellectuals in Diyarbakir were put in this prison here on the left. Sorry, on the right, the building on the right. And they were all killed there, assassinated. And also further up the river, Euphrates. This prison is now being turned into a museum. They're still working on it, but I have hopes that they will turn this into also a memorial place. One of the largest churches, and also I think most beautiful churches, of the Middle East in general, not just the Ottoman Empire, was Surp Giragos, you see an old picture on the left, before the genocide. And on the right, you see the church as I found it when I did my research in the 2000s. It was dilapidated, you couldn't get in. There were these street children, they had to help you open the door and get in. And once we got in, we saw there were drug addicts, there were all kinds of people drinking, throwing bottles around. It was in a decrepit state. Osman Baydemir, together with his staff, they managed to turn this place into a fully functional church, which was consecrated. I think this happened last year or the year before. And for the first time, we see, as you can see, a packed church with lively community activity. If you had told anybody in Turkey 20 years ago, is this ever going to be possible, they would have laughed at you. This is possible, but only at the local level. This is only because the mayor of Diyarbakir is a good guy. Another example, here's a picture of him. Another example is public space. So in Turkey, unfortunately, you still have, the Talat Pasha Street. You have the Enver Pasha Road. You have the Avenue of the Young Turks. So these things are gradually changing. Osman Baydemir has initiated a project in which he changes street names. And here, for example, he has changed one of the names of the streets into Mgrdich Margosyan Street. Mgrdich Margosyan is a famous writer from Diyarbakir, a very funny writer too. These are all, I think, signs of hope and glimmers of positivity. Thank you very much for your attention. The Turkish government is running a worldwide, uniform denial policy. What does this mean? It means that everywhere I go, everywhere where I've given lectures, I'm in Toronto now, I've been in Buenos Aires, I've been in all over Europe, all over North America, everywhere I go, it's always the same guy in the same suit with the same briefcase, sitting in the back of the room. He kind of looks like this gentleman out there. Sitting in the back of the room, always coming up with the exact same arguments against the genocide thesis. There was no intentional killing. The Armenians rebelled, worked with the Russian state. And thirdly, better, if this is all they know, this is the stultification of Turkish society, of keeping it dumb, keeping it ignorant. But there are some glimmers of hope. I'll talk about that in a second. Now, most of these destruction of memory and construction of memory was geared towards the internal audience, towards the Turkish population. There's also a global process going on, global efforts of denial, the denial industry. And there's a whole range of denial policies. Many books have been written on it. I don't want to get into it too much, but I'd like to point out two things. The denial that is geared towards the internal audience, so the national efforts, they're somewhat different than those geared towards the international audience. So internally, they do something slightly includes, without any exception, I think all states have darker pages in their history. It's normal. Of course, the murder of Hrant Dink was probably the pinnacle, or it was the zenith of this denial industry. Because Hrant was somebody who went on television and he said, I'm Armenian and I think there was a genocide. End of story. When he said these things on national television, the society, Turkish society, almost stopped functioning. And I remember there was a debate that started at 8 in the evening and went on until 3 in the night because people kept calling in and asking for clarification from Hrant. Now there's also, and this is very important, there are international and transnational efforts of denial, different from the outward, the external policy. Now, nationally, there's an Institute of Armenian Studies in Ankara. All it does is produce denial and forms of denial, very intricate and sophisticated forms of mystification and manipulation. The Turkish Penal Code, until very short, had an article in which insulting Turkishness was a crime, punishable with prosecution. the Ministry of Education issued a directive in 2003 in which the teachers, and we have a teacher, of course, with us, all teachers were instructed to give a positive view of Turkish history. Now, of course, the nonsensical here is, of course, that no country in the world has only positive history. It doesn't exist. When Germany was occupied, the first thing the American, British, French, and Canadian liberators did was they went into the Ministry of Education and they took out all the Nazi propaganda and they destroyed the propaganda, much of it racist, much of it silenced the violence the Nazis committed themselves, and they started building a realistic history of German history. And after that, since 1945, entire generations of Germans were educated with a correct and truthful, accurate narrative of their own history. This is the crucial difference, I think. And in a way, you can't even blame these people if they have never been taught anything